Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's my pleasure to welcome you all to the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy, virtually if not in person, for our talk series on understanding the 2020 U.S. election. My name is Peter Lowen. I'm a professor at the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy in the Department of Political Science. I'm the director of our Policy Elections and Representation Lab. And it's really my great pleasure to welcome to our school today Devin Phoenix, joining us from University of California in Irvine for this talk. Before I introduce Devin, let me just say that I do want to acknowledge that the land on which University of Toronto operates has been for thousands of years the home of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently the Mississaugas of the Credit River. And today it is a meeting place and a home place for thousands of people across Turtle Island who are grateful to work here and to live here. Devin Phoenix is one of the leading lights of political science in the United States today and one of the leading analysts of American politics. He's an associate professor at the University of California, Irvine. He arrived there after completing his PhD at the University of Michigan. And he's most recently the author of the Cambridge University Press book, The Anger Gap: How Race Shapes Emotion in Politics. He's published in other leading journals, Politics, Groups, and Identity, the Journal for the Scientific Study of Religion, among others. And he's won the Chancellor's Award for Excellence in Fostering Undergraduate Research and the Black Leadership and Advancement Coalition Distinguished Lecturer Award. It's really my pleasure, Devin, to welcome you to University of Toronto for this talk. I'm going to turn it over to you. If folks have questions, I'll ask you to put them into the Q&A, and we'll get to them after Devin's presentation. Sir, the floor is yours, and welcome to Toronto. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you so much, Peter. Thanks to everyone for attending. I look forward to this talk today. And so, as Peter mentioned, I'll be trying to speak to what insights we can draw from the 2020 election and past election cycles from thinking about the way that race shapes emotional responses to politics. So let's get it together. There we go. So I'll be talking about the role of anger in shaping political behavior, but also identifying the racial bounds on who gets to express that anger in political or public spaces. And so I'll talk about this concept that I call the anger gap and the forces shaping it. I identified three forces that shape this racial anger gap in politics. The stigma, who receives pushback or delegitimization or potential legal scrutiny for expressing anger, and how does that kind of jive with racial stereotypes? To what degree do African Americans in particular feel a collective sense of inefficacy or lack of influence over politics? And how does that prevailing sense of a lack of influence shape or inhibit a response of anger to political threats? And lastly, this kind of related idea, what I call racial resignation. To what extent does the belief that politics is unchanging, that it remains staid and unwilling to deal with racial disparities, to what degree does that inhibit the anger? I'll close with thinking about the racial enthusiasm advantage and how positive emotions, particularly hope and pride, play an outsized role in shaping the political behavior of African Americans, and to what degree did we see pride and hope potentially play roles in the apparently larger Black turnout in 2020. So as I go through this talk, I'll be drawing on data from a couple of national data sets, the Collaborative Multiracial Post-Election Survey and the American National Election Survey, highlight some findings or some trends and general observations from an experiment I posed. We'll be looking at some closed-ended responses, some open-ended responses, and I'll try to weave in that data with rhetoric from both elites and everyday people. I want to begin by taking us back to our most recent inauguration, January 20th, 2017. Beyond the quote-unquote record-breaking crowds at Trump's inauguration, we saw actually huge numbers of people gathered both on the lawn in DC and across the world in women's marches. And so these really kickstarted this era of resistance. And what did we see that was very vividly apparent at these marches? We saw a lot of anger. We saw a lot of defiance, right? We saw a lot of people be indignant about this ensuing Trump era. But there is a really clear contrast to draw between that kind of palpable intensity and indignation on display at these women's marches and, switching gears quite a bit, the kind of emotional display in that night's Saturday Night Live episode. So the SNL episode that aired the night of Trump's inauguration in 2017 happened to be hosted by Dave Chappelle. The opening sketch of that episode was an election watch night party. And as I was watching this sketch unfold, I thought, I'm working this into the book somehow. There's a really concrete difference between how the white election viewers are processing the results as more and more states are won by Trump, and how the Black Party guests played by Dave Chappelle and special guest Chris Rock are processing those same results. Just to give you a sense of that contrast, how that contrast played out. At one point, one of the white guests, sounding very despondent, says, Trump might actually win, to which Chris Rock's character replies, I mean, of course, yeah, what are you talking about? As the night is kind of getting called for Trump, one of the white party goers goes, oh my God, I think America is racist. And played it up for really strong comic effect. Dave Chappelle replies sarcastically, oh my God. He goes on to say, you know, I remember my great grandfather told me something like that, but I don't know, he was like a slave or something. And so the contrast on display is quite clear, right, for comedic effect. The Black Party goers are not so much fazed by this election result. In large part, that reflects their kind of static expectation that America does not produce well-meaning or high-quality results, particularly when it comes to race. The Black Party goers are not surprised in the least that a candidate that would base so much of his campaign on racist and xenophobic rhetoric would indeed find electoral success from that. And so even if that cool, calm demeanor is more performative in nature, it still kind of highlights this contrast if African Americans are routinely expecting a politics that is subpar, routinely expecting a politics that produces suboptimal outcomes, particularly when it comes to race and racism. From where does that anger originate? And so why does it matter if Black people are not tapping into the same sense of indignation and anger as their white counterparts? To have an appreciation for that impact, that implication, we have to have an understanding of what role anger plays in our politics. And so we can think about numerous anecdotal examples of anger being very palpable. Think about the anger that motivated the Tea Party movement and how much of that anger is still very visibly present at Trump rallies, both during his 2016 campaign, throughout his presidency. We certainly see anger not limited to the right. We see anger on the left as well. Think about the anger that animated the Occupy movement and how much of that anger within the electoral realm seems to be manifested in the nascent candidacies of Bernie Sanders, right? A young, impassioned set of people behind Bernie Sanders, motivated by their anger, right? And kind of their anger over these perceived economic injustices. Indeed, there's long been conventional wisdom that if you want to get elected, you can effectively mobilize people to come out and support you by getting them angry. At the same time, we can think about the limits. Who can receive benefit from expressing that anger? Who might receive great pushback, particularly based on social identities that they occupy? So it feels like many years ago to some of us, but earlier in the Democratic primary season, when we still had a full slate of candidates, we saw Elizabeth Warren facing criticisms that she was too angry, too antagonistic. When Rashida Tlaib was elected to Congress from Michigan, one of the members of the so-called squad in Congress, these women of color, she received very severe pushback and rebukes from her own party for proclaiming we're going to impeach the mother, so on. Of course, she also was proven right that he was impeached, but that kind of language was inappropriate. That kind of palpable expression of anger was inappropriate coming from this individual. And to what degree was that connected to the racial and gender identities that the individual carries? Contrast, we can think about the representative Ted Yoho, who after allegedly spewing expletives in the direction of Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, apologized for the choice of words, but did not apologize, quote, for my passion, for my God, my family, and country. So he is able to kind of reorient that angry outburst, not as something that is below the belt or something that's beyond the pale of politics, but simply reflecting his passion, reflecting his patriotism, reflecting his faith. And so to what degree do his identities as a white man give him more leeway compared to a white woman or a woman of color to draw on that anger and be a little less apologetic about it or face maybe less pushback for it? Why is anger so palpable in politics? Well, we can think about work from social psychology and political science that gives us a sense of how it moves people, how it shifts people's behavior. So you can't get angry unless there's something that's a source of that anger. And so the work in social psychology and political psychology on threats makes clear that when we face some type of threat, something that impedes our progress towards our goal, that spurs greater awareness and greater action for us. In fact, that's what kind of animates that fight or flight response. So already we're cued in to kind of shift from our status quo and be ready to move. Going further, when we respond to that threat with anger, as opposed to other emotion states, sadness, fear, anxiety, we have increased confidence. In fact, when we're in a state of anger, we're less risk averse, we're more impulsive, more confident in our actions, more willing to act now and think through the consequences later. So anger is an action ready emotion. So it's not surprising that folks, including some folks from the University of Michigan, have found that when people are angry about a prospective outcome they don't like, as opposed to afraid about it, they're more likely to engage in costly political actions, from voting to canvassing to donating to candidates. So we do indeed have this record that shows anger moves people to be more active in politics. And lastly, we've also seen that anger is tied to perceptions of outgroups, particularly racial outgroups, which is really important when we think about our current era of racial and partisan polarization, with those lines often being intersected, and thinking about how much of our politics is characterized by in-groups competing viciously with outgroups, how palpable anger is in not just driving people to act against their outgroup, but further solidifying those group divisions. And anger also kind of erodes people's trust and legitimacy of the system. And we're seeing that play out currently, right, with a large faction of the US electorate that is not accepting the results of the election. And so when we think about anger moving, right, we shouldn't be surprised when we see in this era large mass-based movements, right? And so, of course, in this summer of 2020, we've had what many observers have called the largest protest movements in history in terms of sheer number of participants. Resurgence of Black Lives Matter protests in the wake of the killings of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor. And so how did these expressions of defiance and anger and indignation, primarily led by, represented by Black people, how are they dealt with in the public and political discursive space? Well, we get some indicators of that, right? So in September, Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, said, "We support peaceful demonstrations." Let me move my image out of the way to read this quote. "We participate in them. They're part of the essence of democracy. That does not include looting, starting fires, or rioting. They should be prosecuted. That's lawlessness." You also see framing from media that indicates that people's kind of enthusiastic support for Black Lives Matter that waned over time. These kinds of frames, like this headline, suggest that it's not about kind of natural waning of people's attentiveness or just issue fatigue, but actually people are responding to the unrest, right? And so these kind of continue this way of framing Black-led political movements and Black protests in particular almost exclusively through the lens of property destruction or violence. Is it possible for people to talk about these movements without mentioning the sporadic or episodic instances of violence? To what degree do those become the dominant narrative frame for how we talk about these protests? And what way does that show the kind of weaponization of anger in our US political space? It's not just political space, right? Where we see Black anger or Black expressions of grievance maybe be problematized. We can think about social spaces too. Promise this is my last comedy sketch reference of the talk, possibly. But who remembers the long-running Key and Peele sketch where Barack Obama, despite having the highest office in the land, can't actually express anger without having significant pushback? So he outsources that job to his anger translator, his trusty aide Luther. Right? And so this is a sketch that runs for many years that really taps into this kind of long held understanding, right? That Black people, even in positions of power, maybe particularly those in positions of power and prominence, can't really express anger without suffering real pushback. You can think about beyond politics, right? The degree to which there's a labeled angry Black athletes for athletes that use their platform to speak out in terms or against racial or economic injustices. Whether we're thinking about the athletes at the 70s Olympics or LeBron James being told derisively to shut up and dribble when he talks about political matters. You can also think about the intersection of race and gender here and how Black women in particular might be bound, doubly bound, by this trope of the angry Black woman. This is indeed something that even Michelle Obama spoke about, feeling that label and feeling the stigma of that label. She spoke about that in an interview with CBS soon after leaving the White House. And it's not just kind of social stigmatization, there's also increased legal scrutiny. So when we look at the history of government surveillance and infiltration of Black movements, from Black radical movements such as the Black Panthers to Black, nonviolent passive resistance movements like the Civil Rights movement led by Reverend Dr. King, we see government treating these kinds of movements as a particular existential threat. So we see this FBI report early in 2017 that lists, quote, Black identity extremists as a threat to the safety of the polity. This isn't referring to any particular organization or group, but rather just generally to Black people who might feel aggrieved by the spate of Black killings at the hands of police officers. So just read briefly from this report. The FBI assesses it's very likely that BIE's perception of unjust treatment of African Americans and the perceived unchallenged illegitimate actions of law enforcement will inspire premeditated attacks against law enforcement over the next year. He further says it's very likely additional controversial police shootings and the associated legal proceedings will continue to serve as drivers for violence against law enforcement. So we see within this report an acknowledgement of the spate of police killings of Black people. But that's not what's being problematized. What's being problematized is the potential Black response to it, right? And so Black people have been reading these cues and they understand there might be a cost of expressing anger while Black. We even see with the kind of potential governmental legal response to the protests this summer, Barr proposing to actually charge protesters engaged in violence with sedition, right? Framing these protests as maybe not just disrupting or civil disruptions, but actually as anti-American treasonous types of acts. And so thinking about those bounds, let me tie this to some of the extant literature, again, from social psychology and political psychology, to help us think about the ways in which salient group identities, of which I focus on race, shapes how people do or do not respond to different political threats. So we've got work that shows that when a group believes their members are being unfairly targeted, by a policy or regime, that they do feel angry. That anger can indeed mobilize. But we've got this other side of the coin from a body of work that indicates if people believe that their group's structural position will not improve, then they're not going to feel anger. In fact, they're more likely to feel something like resentment, which is not mobilizing in the same way that anger is. Going further, we have work that indicates, and this is primarily from social psychology, anger is predicated on your perceptions of your agency or your political influence. And so if you feel like you have influence over that threat that you can identify, then you're more likely to respond with anger. But if you don't feel like you have that control, that sense of influence, then you're more likely to feel anxiety. And again, anxiety is not mobilizing in the same way. We have work that does indicate that what people can emote as individuals might indeed be distinct from what they emote if they're not viewing themselves as individuals, but as members of a salient group. And that's really important for us to consider because African Americans do tend to view themselves through the lens of race, right? Kind of taking on a group-centric lens as opposed to a purely individualistic lens. So the sense of capacity or influence they feel as members of a group probably shapes their emotional responses to threat and opportunity. Accordingly, we've got work that does indeed show that people's group-based emotions operate distinctly, particularly African Americans' group-based emotions operate distinctly. Now, thinking about the work on, this is mostly from political science and liberal sociology, Black political attitudes and how Black people navigate politics. We know that Black people generally express less confidence across the board that politics works fairly. We have much less trust and also much less satisfaction modally with the political system, not particularly the regimes or the players, but the system itself, right? There's more skepticism emanating from African Americans. And accordingly, right, we have this body of work that indicates Black people are often seeing race through a structural lens, not focusing on individual level instances of prejudice, but thinking about the ways in which institutions and groups and elites, right, foster continued discriminatory outcomes. And the strategies for navigating those racial stressors vary quite broadly, from direct confrontation all the way to withdrawal. And so tying together some of these academic insights with words of different Black thought leaders, we can kind of understand the range of responses to threat and how that might not engender a palpable sense of anger or indignation. So I want to provide a quote from former Black Panther Deputy Chairman Fred Hampton. Fred Hampton, who was really critical in creating coalitions between the Black Panthers and other partners. He's speaking to a Black audience about the struggles of a Black neighborhood to get attentiveness to a broken stoplight. And he's talking not just about that instance, right, but that general sense of futility that Black people can feel collectively when they try to engage the political system. And he uses quite vivid language. They get you wound up in an excursion of futility, and you be going in a cycle of insaneness, and going back and going back and going back and going back so many times that you're already crazy. So in this little quote, Hampton is articulating the way in which that sense of resignation can set in, and when you have interactions with the system that you feel is not responsive to your interests, rather than feel indignant or angry, right? You just feel kind of very desperate or disparate and kind of disillusioned. I see something similar from the journalism's expert professor and journalist Stacey Patton. This comes from a piece she wrote for the Washington Post on why Black people were not very strongly represented within the Occupy movement. She says, "We told you so. Nothing will change. We've been here already. It's hopeless." Right? So this sense of hopelessness, this sense of despair, or this just sense of resignation, like the system does not change. And this is, she's positing, why Black people aren't more present in the Occupy movement, because they're not confident that anything will change. This is certainly far from the rallying cry, right, that gets people off of the sidelines and into the political playing field. It's really important for us to understand why that pervasive sense of resignation might be more accessible to many African Americans than that sense of indignation or insult to injury. So when African Americans are dealing with these racial stressors in their everyday lives, or kind of in the broader political sense, we see from numerous public health studies their effects, their tolls on their mental and psychological well-being. There are even physiological effects that manifest from maybe increased disease risk to even life expectancy, mortality, and increase in risky behaviors such as smoking, right? So there has to be a way in which African Americans are dealing with these stressors, and it might not always point to the utility of getting mad as all heck about each of these stressors, right? We can think about that pervasive sense that we don't have the influence and power that we would like, that resignation, these things don't change regardless of the kinds of inputs we put in. I see these as manifesting in the racial anger gap. So what is that anger gap? Is it that Black people are looking at the same threats as their white counterparts and not getting as angry or not expressing anger to the same degree? Is the anger gap that once they express that anger, it just doesn't translate to political behavior as effectively as that anger translates to behavior for their white counterparts? It's yes and, right? So I'm finding both in my data, and I'll run through just a few examples of the lack of anger expressions from African Americans and the lack of that mobilizing effect of that anger once it's expressed. So I'll be kind of darting through a couple of different data sets. So first, the CNPS. This is a nationally representative data set that includes large samples of Black, Latinx, Asian, and white Americans. And so I won't talk about it in the talk, but in the Q&A, I can talk about the degree to which the anger gap and the enthusiasm advantage are also exhibited by Asian and Latinx Americans in addition to Black Americans. So I was able to contribute some questions to the 2016 data set, which is asking people these questions soon after the 2016 election. So I asked the whole sample, during the 2016 election, can you just rate how often you felt the following emotions? So you see them here: angry, afraid, sad, proud, hopeful. So these are odds ratios, which means that the baseline of 1 there with that vertical line represents the white response to each of those questions, and the dot and tail represents where the modal African-American response was. And so those dashes are the 95% confidence interval. So what do we see here? Black people are expressing significantly less anger and also less fear and less pride when looking back in the election than their white counterparts. And so these differences, particularly that anger gap, is robust to all types of control variables, right? I can overspecify this model and still this anger gap remains, right? So demographics, partisanship, psychological attachment to politics like interest and knowledge, favorability towards Clinton and Trump, perceptions of discrimination linked to fate, this anger gap persists. And so we know that 2016 and people's reflections on 2016 is most likely going to be a reflection of their views of Trump. And so when we look at expressed anger across the full range of Trump favorability, from on the left here, the most favorable towards Trump, to the right, which is most unfavorable towards Trump. We see with these lines that don't intersect at all, African Americans are still registering less anger, significantly less anger in the reflections on the election than their white counterparts. So maybe we would have thought, well, African Americans that dislike Trump the most are going to be much more angry compared to white Americans that dislike Trump the most, because they're going to feel maybe palpably targeted by some of the racist rhetoric. But that's not the case, right? Even at the level of those that are most unfavorable towards Trump, white people are still saying I was more angry over the election than their black counterparts. And again, these are factoring in controls for demographics and partisanship and all kinds of factors. So taking it back beyond 2016, the American National Election Study since 1980 has asked people the question, have the Democratic incumbent or candidate, has Republican incumbent or candidate made you angry based on anything they've said or done? So what I'm going to show you here are comparisons of Black and white Democrats, their likelihood of saying they were angry towards that Republican incumbent or candidate from the years 1980 to 2012. And so again, these are controlling for a host of factors. And so what do we see here? Again, the black line is a black solid line. It says African Americans, dashed lines, white Americans. Except for 1984, right, the one exception, Black Democrats are consistently less likely to say that they were angered by that Republican incumbent or candidate than their white Democratic counterparts. So here's the mean likelihood across that era, right? With Black Dems more often than not saying they're angry, and white Dems more often than not saying they are angry. This is notable in particular because if you look at approval ratings of those Republicans and approval ratings of the state of the economy under Republican incumbents, Black Democrats are much more dissatisfied than their white counterparts. So that increased dissatisfaction is not translating to increased or even equivalent anger. Looking to how anger affects participation, what we have here are the likelihoods of voting amongst those Democrats, white and Black, that based on the difference of whether or not they said they were angry towards the Republican candidate or incumbent in that given year. So what we see when we look at that black solid line is that it's almost a flat line, right? There's some incline, but Black Democrats who said they were angry towards Republican aren't that much more likely to vote than those that said I wasn't angry. In comparison, for white Democrats with that dashed line, you see much more of an incline, right? So these differences are marginal, as indicated by the overlapping confidence intervals, but still we see much more movement for white Americans. Going back to the 2016 data, where I can look at a greater range of participations or actions beyond voting, we see some clear differences in how much anger is moving white versus Black folks. So this, without thinking about or controlling for partisanship, let me walk you through what this figure is telling you. So let's look at the top set of lines in each of these pairs. That light gray is the likelihood of white participants taking part in that given action if they said they were never angry during the election. Now the candy cane bar represents the likelihood of white people taking that action if they said they were angry all the time. So holding a whole host of cultural variables at their means, we're just isolating what is the effect of saying you were angry all the time compared to saying you were never angry, right? So that's the only dimension along which these participants differ, how angry they were. And so you see, just looking at those kind of candy cane bars, anger makes a big difference for white Americans, right? Their anger makes them, 2 to 3 to 4 times more likely to take part in these actions, all other things held constant, right? So we see anger moving in the way the conventional wisdom says. People that are more angry are moving off the sidelines and taking range in a host of actions. Now the bottom lines represent Black Americans. That dark gray is likelihood of those that said they were never angry. That solid red, the likelihood of those that are completely alike, except for they were angry all the time. You see, those red bars are a lot smaller. And those asterisks represent the differences that are not only substantially large, but empirically distinct from zero, right? So these are statistically significant differences in likelihoods at the 95% alpha level, or confidence level. And so what do we see here, right? For African Americans, the effects are both substantially small and much less frequently statistically distinguishable. The one place where we see anger having the most impact for Black action is in the domain of systems that, or actions that challenge the system from the outside, protests and boycotting. And so this is a theme that I find throughout the book, that when African Americans are expressing anger, that anger is most palpable when directing actions not towards the voting booth, but towards lines of protest. And so I think that really resonates with the extensive history that we continue to see manifest of Black participation in insurgent and activist politics today. But at the same time, it means that in a situation of great political threat, that we might not expect to see increased Black turnout. I think that was certainly the case in 2016, where people were maybe surprised by the degree to which Black and also especially Latinx voting didn't surge in response to the prospective threat of Trump. Oh, maybe it's because, right, this anger gap, right? Either not responding to that threat with a mobilizing anger, or that anger propelling them to want to challenge the system from the outside as opposed to vote for Trump's opponent. And so I want to think about not just what this anger gap is, but what are the origins of it? To what degree does this reflect African Americans saying, well, even if I'm angry, I don't want to express it, right? Because there's a fear, there's a consequence I run into from being angry while Black. To what degree is it reflective of that idea that, well, we don't feel as though our collective influence, our collective input gets responsiveness, right? So we're going to kind of suck it up and find other ways to engage. Racial resignation, right? Connected to the idea of influence, right? When I feel like the system just is kind of locked in place, from where derives the anger to change it? If I don't think change is possible, why get angry about this thing? Why not find other means of coping? So the first thing about stigma, the ANES gave me a small window of opportunity to look into how much of that stigma might be constraining people's responses to that question of, hey, did that outpartisan, in this case, did that Republican make you angry? And so I looked at race of interviewer effects. When Black people, because the ANES is conducted by face-to-face interviews with an actual interviewer, when Black people have a Black interviewer, are they more prone to say they were angry than if they have a white interviewer? And so here are the results for that. So it's a super small sample size. So it's a small sample size alert, right? When you look at the numbers in parentheses, that's the raw numbers of Black or white Dems that had these different interviewers, either Black interviewer or white interviewer. So you see the number of Black Democrats in this sample across this time with a Black interviewer is 50, right? Super small. And yet we still see a pretty notable difference, right? So first looking at that left column, what are we seeing here? For white Democrats, the race of their interviewer makes little to no difference in their likelihood of expressing anger. So the difference between that 0.5 and that 0.54, which is the mean likelihood of saying you're angry, is nil. It's nothing. But looking to that right column, again, all caveats due for that small sample size. Black Democrats are much, much more likely to say they were angry about that Republican when they had a Black interviewer compared to the majority of Black Democrats that had a white interviewer. And so this might be tapping into that sense that, yes, there is this sense of, I can't express this without getting some kind of pushback or some kind of stigma. So I ran an experiment that had relatively decent large numbers of people. This is a quick breakdown of the demographics of the Black and the white sample to see that it's a good mix of people in terms of gender, in terms of ideology or partisanship. I asked the Black sample a couple of questions that I'll highlight here. One was, how much do you agree with this sentence, right? From strongly disagree to strongly agree. I feel a responsibility to my racial group to stay calm in the face of discrimination. A healthy 73 or so percent agreed strongly or somewhat with this sentiment. So I see this as further indicator that Black people are aware of that cost of being angry while Black, and it can inhibit expressions of anger in public spaces, even if it's as simple as on a survey. What about that question of efficacy and influence, right? When we typically think about political influence, we consider conventional efficacy measures. So when we think about your input mattering, we think about external efficacy. And that's typically gauged with these types of questions. How much do you agree or disagree with this statement? People like me have a say in how government handles important issues. Or public officials care what people like me think. Now, people like me is a pretty nebulous concept. It could be my racial group, it could be my neighborhood, it could be my income bracket, it could be my family. So I wanted to get more clarity. So I just wanted to ask a different version of this kind of question that's pitched specifically about you thinking about the influence of your racial group. How often would you say Black people, if you know yourself as Black, or white people, if you know yourself as white, have a say in how government handles important issues. How often would you say public officials work hard to help your racial group? And so looking first at those conventional measures, the mean response of Black people to each of those conventional measures is on the left, the mean response of white people to those measures is on the right. Whether we're thinking about people like me having a say in government, the blue, or public officials caring what people like me think, the red, we see that Black people are expressing much more efficacy. It's not indicated here, but these differences are significant at the 0.95 level. So within this same survey, a little later on, I asked them those versions of the questions that make a race explicit, to avoid agreement acquiescence. I moved from agreement to how often would you say, and it gave me a little bit more ability to discern from one category to another. But you see a flipped result here, right? When now thinking specifically about the influence of their racial group, Black people are reporting much less influence than their white counterparts. And again, these differences are significant, right? And so you think about that contrast here, what I see in this duality, Black people saying as maybe an individual or people like me, whoever that's defined, yes, I feel efficacious, I feel influential. But when asked to think about my racial group specifically, I feel much less influential. Kind of white people showing an opposite reaction. I see here a reflection of Du Bois's double consciousness. I just want to read a little bit from Du Bois's definition of double consciousness, because I think it's really helpful for us to be able to unpack how the duality of Black people's lived experiences shapes their politics, not just their emotional responses, but how they engage politics overall. It's a peculiar sensation, this double consciousness, the sense of always looking at oneself through the eyes of others, measuring one's soul by the tape of world that looks on in amused contempt and pity. One never feels his two-ness, an American and Negro, two souls, two thoughts, two unreconciled strivings, two warring ideals in one dark body whose dogged strength alone keeps it from being torn asunder. And so when I think about that duality of Black people simultaneously being able to think of themselves individually as capable individuals, but feeling that the group collectively is constrained, how does that shape that tug of those emotions? To kind of put that point a bit more finely as I move into resignation, we see strong majority people agreeing somewhat or strongly, in fact, a majority agreeing strongly alone, that no matter how much racial progress is made, discrimination will always affect the lives of Black people. That's what I wanted to tap into to get that sense of resignation. How much confidence or not do you have that the system is changeable, that it is able to adapt and modify to meet your needs? But it's not really those closed-ended responses that I thought was so instrumental, was the open-ended. And so part of the experiment in this national survey was giving people a chance to write about what made them angry about politics or what made them angry about race. So this is the prompt for the people that were randomly assigned to the condition to talk about just what made you angry about politics. Right? And so I want to highlight some of the open-ended Black responses because they were quite notable and evidencing patterns in how Black people thought about political threats and the contrast between how Black and white people thought about them. So this 24-year-old man said, the stuff that makes me angry is for Blacks to still be treated less respectfully and not be liked because of our skin color. Someone outside my race does a hairstyle that's trendy. If my race does it, it's a disgrace. So notice this person is not talking about polarization or policies or party. They're talking about cultural appropriation, which we can think of as not political, but that's a current recurring trend in Black responses. They don't draw a distinction between the political and the non-political in responding to this prompt. For them, it's all politics. For them, it's all making them angry or feel aggrieved. One more here. Well, not one more. Another one. The way that Blacks and Hispanics are treated unfairly with no right to anything basic that the white American will get without stress, having to work twice as hard to earn half the reward and constantly living in fear. This is from a 32-year-old Black woman. So notice here this person not just highlighting kind of challenges faced by African Americans, but identifying a point of solidarity with Latinx folks as well. But notice even the language being used here, stress and fear. These are not words that are evocative of anger or indignation, right? These are words that are evocative of a sense of precarity, of anxiety. We see similarly language that does not evoke anger, but some other response to these threats. This person's litany, kind of listing off a litany of grievances. Tired of officers getting off for killing minorities. Tired of women not being given equal pay as men for the same job. Tired of healthcare being so high and wages being so low. But no, again, what's the language here? Not I'm indignant, not I'm ticked off, I'm tired. That sense of fatigue. How does that tap into that idea of resignation? That sense of, I would love to get angry about this if I had the kind of wellspring to believe that change is possible from that anger, right? Change or anger is an action-oriented emotion. You feel that action isn't going to get the job done, right? From where does that anger go? This person's talking about kind of politicians not making promises, but they say the worst part of it is we as Americans can do nothing to change it. And there again is that sense of intractability. And so there is some real contrast, right? So about a third of Black respondents in this politics condition made explicit mention of race in their responses compared to only about 6% of the white responses. About a third of Black respondents identified something systemic or structural as the source of their anger. Comparison, only about 8% of white respondents identified something systemic or structural. 90% of white respondents are identifying specific objects of their anger, such as parties or individuals or the media or an issue like gridlock or policy domain. So those fundamentally different ways of thinking, I think, have fundamentally different impacts on the emotions felt. So we see racialized view of politics, intergroup solidarity, sense of racial battle fatigue, I'm tired, and resignation. I'll highlight this one last quote. So this is from someone that was assigned to the condition to write about what makes them angry about race. And so they gave quite a developed response. The police brutality is militarized slavery. Further, what ticks me off is the treatment of the offending officers by law. This country will never be an ally of the Black man and woman. The systematic vehicles of oppression, plus the post-traumatic slavery syndrome and mental colonization, perpetuate these events into continuity. I thought, wow, this is someone I could co-author with, right, reading this. But here's actually the last line of what they have to say. We just need to work together more and police ourselves, right? So after this very impassioned diatribe against a racist system and all of its manifestations, they end by turning the gaze inward and focus on what Black people can do to kind of regulate the response to this. So again, I think this is really instructive for us. The anger doesn't engender a sense of, and I'm waiting to step outside and change this. It's more directed towards, well, how can we cope with this? And so anger simply isn't doing the same kind of work that we see for African Americans that we see it doing for white Americans, where that kind of anger for white Americans is pushing them more towards the political playing field and all forms of different actions. So I see a resonance between this quote and that of James Baldwin. To be a Negro in this country, and to be relatively conscious, is to be enraged almost all the time. Many of us see this first half of the quote spoken, but we rarely see the second part. So that the first problem is how to control that rage so that it won't destroy you. And so I've got just a minute left, and I want to make sure I leave plenty of time for Q&A. So I'm going to skip some things to quickly highlight the role of positive emotions in shaping the politics of Black people. So I'll skip these summarizing points and take you back, actually, to another inauguration, January 20th, 2009. So I happened to be fortunate enough to make the trip to DC to witness the historic inauguration of Barack Obama. And the thing that really strikes me that I opened the book with is just the palpable joy from the Black people that have woken up bright and early to be on that, on the Washington Mall. It was so, you couldn't forget it, right? It was joy, it was disbelief, it was pride, all of these. And I thought, in what way are these really critically important to Black politics? And so when we look at comparisons of white and Black Democrats' hope towards Democratic candidates and officials, we don't see any kind of gap like we saw in anger gap. The numbers are quite similar. And in fact, when we look at the effect of hope in shaping behavior before and during the Obama eras, we see that in the Obama era in particular, Black people's hope was much more impactful for their participation than it was for white people. Participation, let's just say turnout specifically. That Black solid line is the difference between the effect of hope on turnout amongst white and Black Democrats. All other kind of factors held constant. So it mattered, and it mattered particularly in the Obama era. We see pride also mattering. That says hopeful, but it should say proud there. These are relatively new slides. Black people are actually on balance more, Black Democrats are on balance more proud than white Democrats. You see that pride especially large in the 08 and 12 years, the Obama era. And while the effect on turnout isn't as notable as in the case of hope, we see, okay, that solid line is in the Obama era. Black people are slightly more likely to act on that pride than their white counterparts as opposed to the pre-Obama era. Why does that matter? Because I saw some indicators of hope and pride in the 2020 election. So as we talk about people rising up to oppose Trump, let's not also lose sight of the fact that many people were inspired to vote in 2020 because of some of the connections they had to the candidates. It's notable that polls coming out of the AP cast suggest that Black Biden voters are more likely to say that they voted for Biden as opposed to voting against Trump. And why would we see that kind of enthusiasm? Let's not discount the hope and pride engendered by Kamala Harris as a descriptively representative person on the vice presidential ticket. Let's not discount the spillover effect of Biden's ties to Obama engendering some secondary hope and pride. And let's not bypass the appeals being made to Black people in these core cities, Atlanta, Detroit, Milwaukee, Philadelphia, that were so critical. Those mobilization efforts weren't simply on the basis of you got to get Trump out. It was on the basis of you got to re-engage and show everyone once again the power of the Black vote after feeling maybe marginalized or taken for granted in 2016. So I'm going to close there. There's plenty more to say, but I think we can get into the Q&A. And thanks for your time, and I look forward to hashing out some more of these issues.
Devin, thanks very, very much. We've got questions in the Q&A. I'm gonna go to those. Then I've got a few, and we've got about 12, 13 minutes. But thanks for that. That's just a real tour de force. I'm going to start with Alison Harrell, who's a political psychology colleague of ours from Montreal. And Alison asks, are there any cultural or social norms among African Americans that might explain the willingness of people to say they are angry? If there is pressure and negative repercussions for Black people expressing anger, then may it simply be a difference in reporting rather than a difference in actual levels. This could also make estimating the effect of anger among Black people more noisy. That's actually a statistical question hiding a deeper normative question.
For sure, and I've still grappled with it, right? And so I do have, those kind of faint indicators I talked about, that maybe it isn't the fact that they're not feeling it, but they're just not expressing it in the survey. So of course, that would mean that the effect of anger is dampened because the people that are in the no anger camp aren't actually that different from the people in the anger camp, right? And so I've tried to grapple with that, and particularly by thinking, especially throughout the book, about ways in which we can think historically about the appeals that are made to Black people, and whether those appeals from elites, Black elites and non-Black elites, are rooted more in getting Black people angry or getting Black people hopeful and proud. And so I think we see a very kind of clear track record of appeals to Black voters or Black participants being rooted in hope and pride. I mean, what's the big buzzword from Obama's campaign? Hope. And what's the kind of resounding message? Yes, we can. Where had Black people heard yes, we can before? From Jesse Jackson's primary campaign in 1984. And what do we see? Energetic Black turnout in that year, in the primary that spilled over into the turnout in the next general election. In fact, when you look at turnout trends, Black turnout rates are more comparable to white turnout rates. That gap is most narrow under Democratic incumbents, and it widens under Republican incumbents. What does that indicate potentially to us? That it's kind of a sense of maybe being able to continue positive things as opposed to opposing the continuation of a negative thing that mobilizes Black people to vote. So I think we do have, beyond that kind of statistical question, some indicators that it's not just a matter of dampening the effect of anger because people are in the no anger camp, but actually some indicators that pride and hope are having these kind of compelling impacts on behavior. And also, if you think about anger, and so I'm using a very bounded definition of anger, but if you think about anger as being something that does make you more impulsive and less risk averse, then the fact that Black people are exhibiting that risk aversion in saying, I feel this way, but am not going to go on the record with it, indicates some level of inhibition of at least the immediate effects of that anger. And so again, we can think about the kind of interruption of the typical effects of that anger. Because if people are saying, I'm mad and I'm unapologetic about showing this, right? They might have an easier translation to direct that to behavior than someone that says, I'm mad, but I have to be mindful of who I show this to. I think you also raised a really good question about the social cues and the ways in which maybe Black communal spaces shape the emotional responses. One thing I found is that Black people that are more religious, at least in terms of indicators of kind of attending church more frequently, for them, anger is kind of less impactful in behavior, and hope is more impactful. So we can also think about the cues that people are getting from those communal spaces about whether anger or positive emotions have more utility for generating kind of Black collective action.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Let me ask you about the kind of I don't want to call it the demand side, but the elite side of it, and which you've just touched on. So do you have a sense of, to the degree that Black politicians are checked in their expressions of anger, and there's been no shortage of expressions of anger by white politicians in the United States, particularly between the years of 2008 and 2016. Right, it was a regular occurrence to see anger as a feature of political rhetoric by elected officials and by other elites. To the degree that you find that Black leaders are not making appeals to anger, is this strategic, or are they sort of being, your sense is, are they being checked by the same social norms that they've internalized about the appropriateness of anger versus hope?
Yeah, I think it's yes, and I think there is a clear strategy, a clear understanding of the bounds, and so I definitely think Black politicians recognize that they don't have license to, even within Black spaces, say, "Hey, let's get mad about this, let's get aggrieved about that," and not just because like of that stigma, but because oftentimes Black politicians, at least those that don't come from majority Black electorates, have that balancing act and feel like I can't alienate potential white voters by being beholden to Black interests. My friend LaFleur Stevens-Dugan has a book that talks just about this, Race to the Bottom. So I definitely think there's kind of this accountability gap, right? When you can't go into a space and say, here's the things that you can be aggrieved about, you're kind of denying the chance to like hold you accountable for doing something better about those things. But I also think there is some internalization of that stigmatization. And so it's not purely strategy. It's also a sense of, well, look, you and I agree. And I think we saw a lot of this from Obama, right? When Obama would speak to Black audiences, there was a lot of critiques the way he would emphasize personal responsibility, kind of speak about Black pathologies. But there's also a sense of resignation there in his kind of acknowledgments, however implicit, that, we're not going to change these things, right? The system is going to remain kind of static. And so what you need to do is focus on what you can do, right? And so what you can do are these things as individuals, as parents, or as teachers, or as educators, or as future leaders for you Morehouse grads. But I think that messaging also resonates because of how kind of connected it is to some of the religious messages that many Black people have adhered to, not just about personal responsibility, but kind of viewing the racial arc as one that makes hope for a racial promised land palpable. So even as I can be resigned, I can still have this hope. And I think there's an interesting tension there that I still need to unpack a little bit. But yeah, I think it's some self-internalization of the bounds, and I think it's some strategy as well, if that answers the question.
Yeah, I mean, do you think these things are positively correlated in the sense that the degree to which hope is going to work as a hope and aspiration are going to work, kind of collective aspiration are going to work as a rhetorical trope, depends on how much anger there is there?
I think it's possible. So one thing that the limitations of my data don't allow me to see is kind of concrete connections between the anger that Black people are willing to register and their feelings of hope and pride. And so one thing I'm looking forward to doing with some shifts I've made to the 2020 version of the CMPS is ask a different slate of questions about what made them hopeful in the past year, what just generally makes them proud. Because my imagination is that for maybe anger has a more direct translation to behavior for white Americans that don't feel the same bounds and also feel a greater sense of entitlement or expectations from the system. Whereas for African Americans, maybe that anger is mobilizing, but it's mobilizing through the route of engendering what I've just been calling a defiant sense of pride, right? So I think similar to your point, I've kind of focused on the connection of anger and pride, but I think there could similarly be some connection between anger and hope. These positive emotions for African Americans play a greater role because they're mediating, right, the effect of their immediate anger on their action. So what I'm really finding is that absent strong feelings of pride and hope, anger isn't mobilizing Black people the way I'm finding it mobilizing white folks. I'm really curious to kind of find an empirical, connection there between those positive and negative emotions.
Yeah, and this is related to something that's I don't know if you observe this in the data, so I'll test this intuition, but it seems to me that the dynamics of anger may play a role as well, right? Where it's kind of the year over year change, right? Or the administration over administration change and anger that one feels that can have kind of temporary mobilizing effects, right? I mean, I think there's the turnout in this last election is remarkable in the United States, right? On both sides, right?
Yeah.
And that's consistent with a shock in the levels of anger, more than it is kind of just heightened at like average, high average levels of anger, right? So I wonder how
Yeah.
much of this is dynamism, and if anger is always high, then there's a ceiling effect there.
Yeah, I think that's a really important observation, right? Because I think part of what makes anger so distinct from other emotions, right, is that it does run hot. And so if it runs hot, it should burn out relatively more quickly than other emotions.
Mm.
And so I think one thing that we see very effectively, but also very clearly from the Republicans, is an understanding, continuing need to keep the base angry about something, right?
Hmm.
There's always something that is being posited as a source of grievance to keep people animated. And I think that's really important for us to consider the degree to which the Republican Party has effectively continued to kind of activate anger and mobilize people on the politics grievance, even when by many metrics, they control most of the levers of power within the US, right? So to look at a group that kind of is in the majority in all these different halls of power and is still feeling as though they're the aggrieved group, I think speaks to maybe some cognitive dissonance, but also speaks to the effective realization of, well, we can't let this group lie dormant. We always have to kind of present something for them to be angry about, which I think speaks to your observation that it's not going to be something that is static. It is something that has ebbs and flows, but also can be activated or inhibited by elites, both at the bigger level and I think community elites as well.
Yeah. I've one final question for you, and it's one that I've asked a lot of our guests through this series, and I'm really interested in asking it of you, particularly after seeing the results where the survey responses that are given depend a lot on who people were talking to. So I've been asking people how, in kind of a time of heightened polarization, how can we have better political conversations? And I guess what I want to ask as an addendum to it is, or in addition to it, is sort of how do we let anger actually have a role in a healthy role in the political conversations that we have?
Yeah, really good question. So I think I draw upon some of the training I was able to receive pedagogically at the University of Michigan, the program for intergroup relations, where they wanted to bring students together to have really difficult conversations, unflinching conversations about the distributions of power across relevant social identities like race, gender, sexuality, religion. And they understood that this is going to be a marathon, not a sprint, right? Like we're going to get you in for the long term. Over the course of this entire semester, we're going to be having these conversations. And so we recognize we can't get into the current events in week 1 or week 2 or week 3. We have to build relationships of trust. And that means we have to have some level of vulnerability and authenticity. And so you can't come into this conversation expecting to have your talking points and expecting to change hearts and minds. First, you got to be willing to speak internally about what made you believe what you believe in the first place. So if you want to really talk about dealing with polarization, we got to be willing to have conversations that look very different from what we're used to. It can't be sound bites. It can't be one sitting. It can't be one session. I think that's really difficult for us as data collectors, right? To really unearth what I'm talking about requires in-depth conversations with people that are built up over time, which is difficult given our timelines, but I'm associated now, so I have that timeline, right? But also, how do you build those relationships with COVID, right? So I'm really thinking about how a static survey can only begin to tell me so much. What would happen if I built up a relationship with this person, either individually or within a group of people that they know and trust within their kind of social setting? How would their responses differ? How would their emotional responses that they register to me differ? So I think that's kind of similar thinking about how to speak across these differences. Are you willing to commit to time to first build relationships and then get into the heavy lifting? And there's a second part to the question that I've forgotten.
Well, it's sort of how we create how we let anger enter
That's right.
conversation
That's right.
in a healthy
Yeah,
way,
so actually think
and for both people in a conversation, I guess. But
I know we're out of time, but I think one of the things I highlighted in the concluding chapter was people that I think Black politicians that were modeling how you can make space for Black anger without demonizing it or delegitimizing it. And one of the people that I highlighted was Stacey Abrams. Stacey Abrams, who isn't just this person that's effective at reaching people where they're at, but is also really effective at connecting to Black voting blocs because of how unapologetic she is about speaking about their grievances. If you go back to her record, even as a college student at Spelman, right? She clearly breaks from rhetorical playbooks by whereas other people are looking to kind of say, oh, well, you're not all that different from everyone. She's like, no, this group is different. This group has specific vulnerabilities and challenges. And yeah, they should be mad. Yeah, they should be taking to the streets, even as other Black elites are chastising them for doing that. So I think we're seeing between Stacey Abrams and the mayor of Jackson, Mississippi, Chokwe Lumumba Jr., and maybe a more prominent figure like Nina Turner, people that are willing to say, no, Black people have a right to be angry about this. They have a right to be aggrieved about this. And at least in Abrams' case, we've seen how effective it is at animating greater Black support without alienating sufficient numbers of white voters. So I think just by saying, look, we're going to speak with clarity about what the stakes are and how those stakes are different from us can be an eye opener that has immediate dividends of mobilizing and energizing Black people that aren't used to that kind of space being given, while also maybe not alienating white people to the degree it might be alienating.
Devin, I want to thank you very much for joining us. I've learned so much from your book, and it's just always great talking to you. And I really hope we can get you up to Toronto in person when all this stuff is past us. I'd encourage you all to buy Devin's book, The Anger Gap, available from Cambridge University Press. And until we see you again, Devin, thanks so much for joining us. It's really been our honor, and we'll look forward to welcoming you back to Toronto as soon as we can.
Thanks so much for having me. It's a real pleasure.
Cheers.